Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Hack Education. Happy birthday to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. We'll have
You're
to
never going to
imagine
hear
me
me do
blowing
that
out the
again.
blowing out the candles.
2 years.
2 years, which is it's very strange and wonderful to think that I've actually had this, had this blog going for such a short amount of time, and yet I'm thrilled with what I've been able to accomplish with this site. So, yeah, 2 years, 2 years.
670 plus posts.
I know. I think I did some napkin math, and I don't seem to take very many days off.
Interesting. How did you do that? Just were you able to actually show the days that you posted?
Yeah, yeah. So because the blogging system that I use for my blog is one that my boyfriend has composed. So we were able to crunch some interesting numbers and looking at when I've posted and how often, what days of the week. So I tend not, yeah, I tend not to take, any vacation and work weekends.
Which just means that what you do is your life.
Absolutely, it is. It is.
Hey, anything to learn from your most popular posts?
I thought that this one of the things that I thought was really interesting. I mean, the popular posts, I think, in some ways, are a reflection of what stories get picked up by these other news aggregators, Reddit in particular. So if a story becomes sort of goes viral, then the amount of traffic just continues to bubble. What I thought was actually interesting was looking at the tag cloud of the term of the some of the keywords that have appeared again and again in my blog, and I was really surprised to see Google be so large. And I think we don't often think of Google as being an education company, but clearly between YouTube and Chromebooks, which I talked about this week, Google Apps for Education, search, I think that it was a pretty it's pretty obvious that Google actually does have a huge role to play in how we use technology today. And so that, to me, that I was surprised to see that Google was so much larger than some of the other things that we thought, that seem obvious, like, textbooks and iPads and things like that.
Yeah, I was interested in that as well, especially because Apple and Pearson appear so much smaller.
Right.
And I felt like they're sort of equivalent targets in a lot of the posts that you do, but obviously Google really predominates.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that, if you think about it, I mean, like, if there are so many products that Google has created that even if they're just sort of tangentially related to education, YouTube is a great example that that come up again and again. But I was really surprised that Google was so much larger. So
You said, this will remain a place for me to rant and rave, to stew and chew on learning theories, tools, and practices, to be contrarian, loud, and fearless.
yeah.
What? Nothing about being snarky?
I'm trying to tone down the snark. I'm trying to. I don't know. Yeah, I should have
Oh,
had.
no, no.
I should have had snarky in there. I suppose that is a key adjective. That's part of the ranting and raving, though, I think.
Well, this first story of Facebook helping us rethink COPPA
Hmm.
was really interesting to me. And the first thing that struck me was the 901 million users. Did that come out as part of the IPO? Because I must have missed it.
The Facebook does keep up to date on one of its press pages its statistics, and so it is. The last time I think that there was a big hullabaloo around the IPO, I think it was 800 million. But clearly, it's been on a hard push to get to that 1 billion user mark. But I think what was really interesting, I mean, there were lots of really interesting things about the rumors that Facebook is going to allow kids under 13 to sign up. Is the fact that is Facebook plateauing in the number of users who are signing up for the site, and are they the quote right kind of users? The people continue to join Facebook from all over the world, but advertisers, and of course, Facebook is, particularly now that it's gone public, is so, it seems to be, everyone seems to be so much more concerned about sort of this question of revenue, advertising revenue. That is Facebook going to have to sort of have new markets in terms of age group and not just in terms of sort of spreading to developing nations. And so I think that the impetus behind opening the doors to having more having more younger users on Facebook seems to be an interesting one that's definitely connected to the IPO.
It's a little bit of a dilemma.
It's a
Facebook
huge
has a
dilemma.
reputation for being aggressive,
Right,
right? They don't have a good track record on privacy.
right.
But many of us have been wishing that COPPA were different. However, the moment I read this story, I thought, oh, I actually kind of like some aspects of COPPA as a parent.
Well, and I think that this is, I mean, I think that this is definitely one of the things that is really difficult and sort of, fraught about this particular story is that on one hand, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think that some of the research that Dana Boyd has done that points out, that because of the way in which COPPA is written, we're actually finding, and because of the draw, not just of sites like Facebook, but because of the draw of the web in general, that kids want to be able to participate in communities online. They want to be with their friends. They want to share with their families, and COPPA on the surface sort of prevents that from happening in the guise of protecting children's privacy, protecting their information. But what we're finding is that it's actually prompting children, and with the permission of their parents, to lie about their age in order to gain access to, it's not just Facebook. I mean, you can't have a Gmail account, for example, unless you're 13. And so I think we're finding that COPPA is actually so poorly written that it's sort of undermining any of the sort of protections that were supposed to be in place. And I think one of the suggestions that Dana Boyd makes is that perhaps we need to rethink this question of who are we protecting? Should it just be anyone under 13, or should we have better systems by which all users are protected, in which there's more transparency about how all of our data is used, and not just those who happen to be under 13 or whatever sort of arbitrary. I mean, and it does feel arbitrary when if you have an 11-year-old who's more mature than a 14-year-old, for example. That age does feel arbitrary, and parents want to be able to make these decisions themselves. And yet, the rub is that Facebook doesn't seem like the right organization to sort of for us to rally behind in terms of rethinking these rules.
But again, almost 1 billion users, they are in a position in terms of sheer numbers to bring this to the fore.
I think so, and I think that one of the things, again, this is all sort of very preliminary information from a Wall Street Journal story, but Facebook says that they're working on, or the rumors are that Facebook is working on a technology that would allow parents to give permission for their kids to join. And I mean, and that's, again, one of the things that COPPA stipulates is that in order to sign up those under 13, you have to have parental consent, and that either has to be, oftentimes it's asking a parent to give a credit card number, or some way of verifying that a parent says it's okay for the kids to join up. And so if Facebook can work out a technology solution, then that does open the door, I think, in interesting ways for kids to be able to participate more fully online. But what does that look like, again, to tie a kid's account to a parent's account? And I think that too is making all sorts of assumptions about the relationship that kids might have with parents, and how long does that last? Do parents get to retain sort of backdoor access to their kids' Facebook account until they're 18? There seems to be a lot of things that will still need to be worked out.
I've never really fully understood some of the subtleties of this, in part because schools outsource to a lot of companies student information systems that have data on students who are under 13.
Right.
So there are commercial companies, and COPPA is about commercial companies keeping
Mm-hmm.
data. And so we already have in place ways of the school delegating to a commercial company that I don't see them getting sued for violating COPPA. Although there have been a couple of high profile cases where social networking sites that worked really hard to get parental permission did face fines from COPPA.
Right. I mean, I think that, I think that part of this, and this is something that we've touched upon repeatedly, is that these laws seem sort of woefully outdated when it comes to new technologies. I mean, COPPA certainly predates the explosion of web and social networking, and I think that COPPA, FERPA, both of those rules that sort of stipulate what you can and can't do and share and gather and sell in terms of student data and children's data, they don't. It doesn't seem quite in sync with the way in which the internet and the web operate today. And I think that sort of we do have to really think about what does it mean to share information, to share personal data, and how do we rewrite these laws so that everyone is protected, and that there's more accountability and transparency across the board.
So you mentioned Google. I've been under the impression that Google's terms of service require that you be an adult in the country that you reside in. And I've always thought that was 18. So for not Google Apps for Education, but just regular Google, do you know what the actual age is?
Um, that's a good question. I know that when they first opened up Google Plus, they said 18 or over, but and I maybe I'm speaking out of terms here. I did think it was 13 to get a Gmail account, but perhaps it is older. And perhaps I mean I think that that's this other odd thing about these sorts of rules as well is that the 13, COPPA 13 to be if you're a U.S. citizen, different ages elsewhere. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm looking on the web now, and I don't know if this is still current, but in Google's terms of service, it says you have to be of legal age to form a binding contract with Google.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I am interested also in the degree to which sort of money and power would dictate who's going to get dinged on this,
Yes.
right? I mean, are they going to go after Google?
Well, and also thinking about the amount of money that the technology industry is spending on lobbying these things as well. I think that Facebook spent hundreds of thousands of dollars just last quarter alone on its lobbying efforts around COPPA. And I'm sure that both Google and Facebook, for obvious reasons, want. I mean, tied back to what I said earlier about having quote the right sort of demographic to be able to sell to advertisers. I'm sure they'll try very hard to get if COPPA is to be reworked, to certainly get this reworked in their favor so that they can sell sell our data to advertisers.
There are two things that, again, I have different hats. One is the educator hat, and the other is the parent hat. When our daughter turned 13 last year, it was actually kind of a nice moment to go through the process of her signing up for Facebook and kind of talking about that. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, very much a memory of a transition. I also do appreciate this idea of not soliciting, not commercial companies not having data about kids, because that feels to me like it is inappropriate marketing. I've always been very disappointed when companies market products to kids.
Yeah, I think that and I think that this is really something that Facebook, I think that Facebook in particular here, if we're thinking about Facebook letting those under 13 on, I think it'll have to tread really carefully, particularly around the advertising that shows up. Um, and I think that there are plenty of sites that are geared towards kids. Disney's a great example with something like Club Penguin too. How do you create a place where kids want to be, where kids are welcome, but kids aren't being inundated all the time by advertising? And sadly, ads are what runs the web in a lot of in a lot of places. This is what funds it. And so, if we have to, I think we have to really think carefully about what's being bought and sold, and how much of that is our data.
So, how big was the word MOOC in your cloud tag?
I don't think it was that big, because it's really just been in the last, oh gosh, I would even say in the last sort of 9 months that MOOC has exploded in popularity, thanks in part to Stanford. But certainly, I think it is one of the most important trends of the year. If I were to pull the keywords from this year, I think MOOC would be one of the big ones.
So, you have two posts on MOOC this week. One is thinking about the infrastructure that lies behind a MOOC, and in a very related way, words or the lack thereof to distinguish between different kinds of what we're calling MOOCs.
Yeah, this question of the infrastructure one is, I think, is really important. And certainly one of the things that I notice a lot about education technology is I think that we forget to talk about the technology under the hood. And I think that you can actually judge a lot based on that. And I think that the MOOCs are a great example of that. When you think of something like the sort of original or the early impetus towards MOOCs, which sort of grew out of the connectivist theories, that the technology that sort of drives those projects is very different than these later versions, these Stanford ones that look and feel very much like a learning management system, in which all of the discussions, all of the assignments, everything happens on one place on the web, that you have to go there and register and sign up in order to participate, versus the connectivist model, in which things happen all over the web and then they're aggregated. There things that happen. The learning is distributed, but there's an aggregation model that pulls that together and feeds that either through an email or a RSS or a blog, pulls that information together, and then again distributes it out to everyone's inbox. So I think that thinking about the technology, it definitely highlights some of the profound differences between the connectivist and the Stanford model MOOCs that I talk about in the language piece too.
Is it too simplistic to see a part of this difference being between those who are looking to construct the financial model and those who are not? I mean, sort of Blackboard's course sites, the Stanford, and some of the other sort of large-scale initiatives, those seem to be designed to want to draw you to a single place, I would imagine, because of commercial aspirations.
I think it's certainly commercial aspirations. I think it's control. I think that control is probably connected to that. I mean, you'd want to be able to see, for example, you'd want to be able to count page views of people who visited that lecture or read that material or participated in that discussion section. Whereas if everything's distributed across the web, you aren't necessarily able to sort of get your hands on some of the data that folks might be interested in gleaning. So but I do think you're right. I do think that it is this commercial piece, but I also think that it's replicating, whether it's still commercial, replicating the model that we've seen in the traditional institution, right? Where universities, when they put their materials online, certainly MOOCs aren't the first or only iteration of online learning, but when universities do put their content online, they have, particularly when using a traditional learning management system, they have put everything on in one place behind a paywall, and sort of walled it off from the rest of the web.
It feels as though there are some parallels. Facebook versus sort of aggregated social media.
Yep.
The Apple ecosystem versus Android and the variety of others. That to some degree we kind of want both. We appreciate the consolidation, we appreciate the ease of use of things being in a single place, and yet at the same time, there's value in the freedom to pick and choose. And the quote I think from the Stephen Downes is this called GRS Shopper,
Uh-huh. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Is the initial assumption that people were going to be outside the system for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But my guess is that if you look at adoption, you're more likely to get adoption from the aggregated systems versus the disaggregated ones.
Yeah, I mean, I perhaps, and I don't think that. Yeah, I think that certainly if you were to look at the sort of the enrollment in the Stanford model MOOCs versus the enrollment in some of the earlier versions, perhaps that's true. And I don't think that there's anything that would stop learners from putting together a system that looked a lot more like Stephen Downes' model than and and thinking about what happens outside the walls of a particular learning management system. But I do think that it reveals again the focus on the institutional control and as you said, the institutional desire to monetize the content versus a learner focused, and learners are all over the place interested in bits and pieces and not just stuck in a system in which they're expected to sort of follow the instructions of the lecturer.
Very interesting. So let's talk about the language of MOOCs.
Yeah.
I laughed out loud at MOOC Guffin, right? You said you made that up, but it sure sounded like something that I could buy at McDonald's with a hitcher on it.
There you go.
So massive online open course. Each part of this acronym raises some questions, right? I
Well, I think
mean, how
so.
massive? How big is massive?
I mean, I think that all of them do. I mean, and this is one of the things that I struggle with all the time now, particularly as as you said, as I've been writing more and more about the trend. I feel like every time I say MOOC, I feel like I need to sort of go back and explain its origins and talk about the early versions and the vision that Dave Cormier and Stephen Downes and George Siemens, Alec Koros, David Wiley had initially about MOOCs and what they look like now, thanks to sort of Coursera and Udacity and the Stanford AI class, MITx. They're very different. And MOOC is an acronym that's supposed to make it easy to understand what we're talking about, but it doesn't. And I think that the question of massive is just from the get-go. I think that what Jim Groom is doing with DS 106 in some ways is MOOC-like, but I don't know. There are only a couple of hundred folks who are participating in that community. So is it a MOOC? Do you have to have thousands, tens of thousands, now hundreds of thousands of students in order to qualify for sort of official MOOC status? Or and then too, I think that it's particularly on a university campus where there are many lectures in which you can actually John Boyer at Virginia Tech is a great example. I mean, he has 3,000 students in his face-to-face, well, in his lecture hall, on offline, and so I mean that's a massive class. I think thinking about the numbers is just one of the problems when we try to sort of unpack exactly what's going on with these.
Is this any different though than say unpacking social networking? I mean, is it just that a phrase kind of gained some acceptance, represents in general a different direction, and you just have to live with the fact that it's not as fully nuanced as you would want it to be?
Perhaps. I mean, I think that is. I think that is. I think that could be. I mean, I think too, though, it is, to me at least, it is worth spelling out this alternate. Gosh, it's like I just said, alternate vision. I mean, again, like this was the original idea of the connectivist MOOC, and now it's the alternate vision. I don't want to lose the nuance here, and I don't want to lose that initial idea, which was thinking about how people can connect at a massive web scale because of these technologies. So it seems a shame to lose that initial impetus and hand over the term MOOC to the Stanford model.
Good. Okay, learn Zillion.
Yes.
Video lessons for students, professional development for teachers. This raised some interesting questions for me in terms of the difference between a platform for innovation and products. And we've
Yeah.
talked about this before, but this felt very much to me like in order to succeed, it's going to have to get adopted by institutions broadly.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than being a platform for innovation, it's a specific kind of offering. And is anybody seeing success with these kinds of offerings?
I think that this is. I think that Learn Zillion is one of very actually only a very small handful of startups that are beginning to think about sort of doing PD differently, thinking about the use of online video differently. But I think you're right. I do think it still feels like a very small piece. Of course, Learn Zillion is I think only a year old. They're still they're still sort of in beta, figuring out what they're building, how they're serving teachers, what the needs are. But it does feel as though this again quickly becomes about a product, and how do you productize professional development, right? So it's not just how do we change professional development for teachers so that it's more so that the experience is better, so that it's more hands-on, so that it's actually less like the lecture hall. But then I think quickly once you start to work through new technologies and think about scaling and meeting needs efficiently, you things start to look like a tech product.
Well, I love the idea that educators would film themselves
Mm-hmm.
teaching a lesson and then be able to share and show that with other educators. But I have a hard time imagining that happening unless you were in a really sort of focused community, a learner centered focused community of a particular school or school system that provided this sort of safety of this. There's time to do this,
Yes.
and we want you to do it.
Well, I think that that's precisely right. I think that that's actually one of the challenges that this is somewhat akin to Lesson Cast, which you had Khalid and Nicole Smith on your show last week,
Hmm.
I think,
Hmm.
and thinking about how do you help sort of build capacity among particularly and share knowledge among teachers. But yeah, how do you do that in a way that's not sort of transferring the burden back onto the teachers themselves? Because making a video, even making a short 2 minute video, can still be take an app take hours in order to do. And I think that having creating a space in which you are thinking about what visuals do you want to share. Is this do you want to record me in front of the classroom? Is this do I have to animate things? Do I want to show you my slides? I think that there are a lot of considerations that makes it easier said than done. Then somehow video has the power to sort of change how we think about professional development. And in the case of Learn Zillion, I mean, one of the things I liked about Learn Zillion is that it had a dual role to it, that these videos could be shown to students, but these videos could also be sort of help generate ideas and practices for the teachers. But that's only like a rare sort of video that's going to be able to serve both of those purposes, I think.
I like any organization that holds something called Teacher Fest,
Yes.
but I don't. I'm not being critical, but I'm starting to think of this from a meta perspective, which is: are there times when technology kind of tricks us into believing it's going to solve things that are hard to solve otherwise? So I'll give another example. So let's say that we're very interested in the how students are learning guitar pieces and using YouTube to copy and perform guitar pieces.
Mm-hmm.
If you tried to package that and sell it to people, I don't think it would work.
Right.
I think what works is it's kind of a meme on top of a platform.
Yeah, no, and I think that I think that there's something to, I mean, again, contrasting Learn Zillion with Lesson Cast, one of the interesting things about Lesson Cast is that when teachers go through the process of thinking about how to make a video, it's actually another layer of PD for the filmmaker, for the video maker themselves, really thinking about the process, the sort of the processes of delivering thinking about how do you deliver that lesson in the classroom? How do you package up the wisdom around that to other teachers? And so I think that there's something really useful about that experience of well, it's an experience of thinking of lesson planning and of teaching. And I think you're right. I think that it on one hand, it looks as though video might offer an interesting solution to this, but really, it's actually about spending some time to to really be thoughtful and reflective about your own practice, and then finding a way to connect and share that with other people. Is technology the answer? Sure, in terms of the internet connections, like we were talking about before. Is a platform the answer? I'm not sure.
Yeah, you and I talked about this when we were at that Open Education Summit. And I think the temptation is to take sort of all of our baggage of things we'd like to see change and pin those as hope onto a technology.
Yes.
And the other place that this occurred for me was sort of these attempts to create mentor environments for students.
Right.
And I'm thinking about how hard it is for a student to find even a physical mentor just because of the trust issues and the connection and the right moments and the sort of the serendipity. And I think we would like to believe that if we created a network for students to find mentors, that they would kind of flock to it. But I don't think they will. And I'm struggling with this because I love the idea, but I think sometimes we're trying to use the technology to accomplish something that in fact is significantly more complex and difficult than that.
And I think you talked about sort of how quickly these things become products, and I think that that's part of the danger too, is that once it's really different to have a situation where affinity grows. You find your community and you feel part of it, and you want to participate, whether as a mentor or as a mentee, and then funneling that through a system that requires buying and selling and matching and checkout and something that looks a lot more like that's dictated by market forces, and market technologies than it is about sort of the way in which humans connect with other humans that they want to interact with and spend time with and learn from.
I don't want to make too much of a connection, but I actually thought of this in regard to the word technique as it relates to your reading of the Technological Society.
Yeah, this was a funny story. This was one of those stories that sometimes I write things and I don't expect them to, or I don't expect the story to sort of go in a direction that it gets picked up. But I've actually been thinking about the Technological Society a lot. I'm preparing a keynote that I'm giving in a couple of weeks about sort of the rise of robotics in education, like the robot graders that we've been talking about, robot teachers, robot assessment, robot tutors, adaptive learning, and just thinking about the sort of the things that Alul talks about in terms of technique and efficiency, and the drive towards efficiency that he identifies as sort of systemic throughout our entire society, but that certainly we're seeing I feel as though we're seeing more and more in education, particularly around sort of the rise of these like I said, the rise of the robots.
It seems to me there are two different reasons for creating a system. One is that there's complexity and difficulty, and it's a way of sort of capturing good.
Mm-hmm.
And another is that it actually comes from the fear of not being able to handle something, right? So there's complexity, and we want to create a system because we're not really interested in having to deal with the complexity, although arguably that complexity is a very important part of it. So I notice this as a parent, right?
Mm-hmm.
I quickly shift the control because I don't want to have to actually deal with the deeper issues that would be much more productive to deal with. So I've sort of
Yeah.
wondered about that. And is there, am I, am I, am I way off base in terms of thinking about this with regard to his use of the word technique? But it does feel, because it feels to me as though some technique actually is very healthy and helpful.
Well, I think that the one of the things that he talks about is that the way in which that the thing, or how do I want to explain this, that technique, that I think the danger becomes in which sort of the dictates of the machine and the dictates of technology actually start shaping our interactions rather than us dictating the future of technology. That we make decisions based on what's good for the machine, what's good for the system, what's good for what's most efficient, what and that isn't necessary. Those aren't necessarily the things that are best for spontaneity or for human connection, for creativity. So I think that it's about. I think when he's talking about technique, he's talking about sort of efficiency and bureaucracy and automation and sort of capital S systems. And I do think that there are times in which that moves things forward, but sort of at what cost?
That reminds me a lot of the really thoughtful discussion Kevin Kelly has on the Amish use of technology
Yes.
and his reflection on how they're not anti-technology, but that they have somebody in the community try the technology out, and then they get together and they talk about what the long-term impact of using that technology will be on things that they care about. Now, that's a really sort of thoughtful, reasoned approach,
Right.
but we don't often do it.
Now I just had to jot down a note to make sure I cover him in my keynote. Good.
Well,
Thank you.
we didn't have television in our home for our kids when they were up until some years ago, but we made a conscious decision that was something we felt was not going to be helpful. And it's that kind of thinking that it seems like we need to be doing about systems that develop. Now, we've seen this in spades with the financial crisis, right?
Right.
We created systems for economic gain that then end up kind of driving everything into the ground.
Well, and I think that that's, I mean, I think that that's one of the things that makes this question of robot, of the robot, of automation in education, for me at least, one of the most important things to pay attention to right now. Because when if we think of why do we want to automate things? Like, what is this if it's labor saving, like whose labor and why? And I think that we need to be very thoughtful about how we're moving forward with these technologies that are ostensibly going to make things easier for teachers, better for learners. But that if the driving force behind that is efficiency, then sort of, again, like what are the trade-offs?
Fascinating discussion. Are you willing to tell us where you're speaking so we can keep track of it?
I'm speaking at a law conference actually in San Diego just a few days before ISTE.
A law conference.
Yes, that's and that. Then this ties nicely with my little homage to the sci-fi writer Ray Bradbury. But it's my talk is going to be using Isaac Asimov's The Three Laws of Robotics and how what those might look like for education technology.
How interesting. Can't wait to hear about it. So you are now playing with a new Chromebook.
I am playing with a new Chromebook, or I was playing with a new Chromebook yesterday, but I do confess I'm back on my Mac today. Sorry, Google.
And this wasn't just because of not having backlit keys.
No, I think that although that I found that irritating. We mentioned last week that the new Chromebooks were out, and Google offered to send me one to test drive, and there are some definite improvements to the Chrome operating system. I think that these are fine laptops, probably for most students in most settings. It's just not a computer that I'm ready to work with. Partially because I need the internet, and I use a lot of desktop software still.
Well, some of the argument for the Chromebook is both financial and technical
Mm-hmm.
in terms of benefit for the school, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not paying for additional software,
Right.
not having complex configuration and
Well, just
whatever process you go through.
the speed with which these devices boot up. I mean, it sounds. I think it's one of those arguments that if you've not sort of used, particularly if you think about sort of laptop carts where computers are distributed. You get the laptop cart in the classroom, and you have to hand out the laptops and get all the students up and online and signed on. The computer's booted, get everyone signed on. That's a good 15 minutes out of the class period. Chromebooks are amazing. I mean, I still, every time I open the lid and it comes on, it boots up right away, and you just log in with your Google password. Even if you're rebooting it, it reboots within seconds. That right there is a huge perk for anybody using these in a classroom setting. They are so easy to get students up and running on. And because everything's, based on your Google Apps account, everything is sort of stored in the cloud. It's right there where you need it. If you're signing onto somebody else's computer, it's still completely personalized to you.
Yeah. Put in a good word for me with Google, will you? I want to play with one. Okay, so the state of Louisiana makes a bold bid to privatize schools with a voucher program. I have such mixed feelings about these voucher programs. On the one hand, I really do believe that in order to rethink sort of institutions that have become laden with policies that you have to create an environment conducive to innovation. But I just struggle with the voucher side.
I completely agree with you. I mean, it's very hard to make it's very hard for me to be able to articulate an argument where students and parents shouldn't have a choice, where you're sort of stuck with with lousy circumstances, lousy educational choices, or no choice on where to send your student or where to send your child. But I think seeing public dollars being used in this particular case in schools that aren't even that there seems to be no plan in Louisiana on how we're going to sort of verify who's a teacher, how we're going to assess these schools. Are these voucher schools going to have to do standardized testing? How are we going to accredit them and ensure that they're good schools? What are the consequences if they're not? And just seeing some of at least in this Reuters story, seeing some of the schools that were going to be getting money, it's actually horrifying. And not sort of invoke sort of Soviet Audrey, but choice is bad here. This was clearly an example of choice, sort of like the false illusions of choice. If your choice is Coke and Pepsi, they're both actually terrible choices. Choice isn't always such a great thing.
So free market proponents in the education arena would say, we already have really bad schools.
Right.
Right. And, how are we actually going to get to a place where people sort of rethink their decisions around education unless we offer choice? Is that a reasonable argument?
I think that argument, on one hand it does sound reasonable, right? If the public school system isn't meeting the needs of students, if parents aren't satisfied, if they aren't doing a good job educating children, then we should be able to sort of easily find alternatives that aren't just alternatives for those who are wealthy enough to afford private schools for their children. But I think that, to me, it feels as though we are forgetting the part of the mission of public schools is very much a civic community project. And this isn't, if something is broken, then the alternative isn't just to go find a private option that suits your needs. It's actually to work on improving public education and work on improving the community, not abandoning it, not removing the funding, not picking out the sort of elite students, the wealthy students, the academically advanced students, and leaving sort of everyone else to suffer.
I'm so conflicted on that one. Okay, but I don't think I'm conflicted on this one. McGraw-Hill and Western Governors University create an agreement that the university is going to pay a low amount for course materials, but then there's going to be sort of a performance bonus if the students do well in their grades. Okay, so that says to me that there must be a belief that the um, course materials are the most important aspect to a student's achievement.
I think that this is such an interesting this is such an interesting move because, of course, the Western Governors University has been one of these big proponents for sort of competent, right? This is a competency based higher education, and I think that it's really interesting to see McGraw Hill adopt that language, right? So, which is the textbooks and the materials that we're selling students directly with the higher ed level, selling students directly, have to somehow also fit into this larger model of what's how students are performing, what they're learning, and what they're able to sort of demonstrably show us that the class has given them. And so I find this is a very this is a very interesting development, particularly in terms of the amount of money that's spent both at higher ed and K through 12 on textbooks and on digital material. What does it mean to actually put the onus not just on the teachers for how well people perform, but put the onus back on the textbook publishers and the curriculum, the curriculum providers for their stake as well. I think it's interesting.
Well, I know when we talked about the Apple announcement on textbooks, there was a feeling like, um, the textbook industry is doing everything they can to stay relevant.
Mm-hmm.
This almost felt to me a little bit self delusional, right? As though the textbook has enough of an impact to actually pin your revenue hopes on the achievement levels of the students versus the quality of the
The
teachers and the
teacher, the
school
students,
environment.
the student, and the students themselves. I absolutely agree. I think it's really interesting, and we'll see how. I'm going to be very curious to sort of follow this and see if this model fits anywhere else outside the sort of Western Governors University model of education as well. I mean, this I can't imagine. I mean, I just can't imagine this working in all sorts of environments for precisely the reasons that you'd say.
Interesting. More McGraw Hill news related to Instructure.
Yeah, this was so McGraw Hill Instructure, which is a learning management system, have signed a partnership so that you'll be able to access McGraw Hill. McGraw Hill has a new portal. It's called McGraw Hill Campus that lets you sort of easily buy ebooks through a single sign-on. To me, this was an interesting move, partially because I think of Instructure as a sort of new upstart learning management system right now. Seeing Instructure line up with McGraw Hill is an interesting partnership, thinking about Pearson aligning with Newton, Pearson's development of its open class and its own learning management system, whereas Blackboard in the scheme of things. So clearly, learning management system plus content, textbook content provider is sort of seeing the powerful companies line up. So interesting that McGraw Hill would do so with Instructure.
For my award of the week for the best name, Hacker U.
Yes.
Hacker YOU, but obviously with a connotation of U like for education or university.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, I've covered these sorts of whether they're nonprofits or for profits quite a bit this year with sort of in this desire for more and more people to learn how to program. HackerU grew out of what was initially a not-for-profit called Ladies Learning Code that had small weekend-long, day-long gatherings in which women learned some development skills. They're now making this a for-profit company to focus on longer courses, but hoping that they can still keep that small, intimate student to instructor ratio. They're a Toronto-based company.
Interesting. Brain Hive. Tell me about this because this seems like a pretty positive direction here.
Yeah, this is definitely a different model than how we're typically seeing digital library books work. This is a pay-as-you-go model for K through 12 schools that they pay per book that's checked out, rather than what happens typically is that schools buy a license for a digital copy. And then, in some ways, that digital copy has many of the same restrictions that a physical copy would. For example, you can only lend out one copy. If you have a digital copy of the Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, you can only lend it out once, even though it's digital. And hypothetically, you could you could sort of distribute to everyone in the school. So if the Brain Hive is addressing that as well, or if you there aren't going to be those same sort of restrictions with how how books are lent. But for every loan, it's $1. So it is a different sort of model, and hopefully we'll address some of the questions too about sort of really these sort of expensive subscription plans, expensive licenses that schools are having to pay for in order to deal with companies like Overdrive, for example, which handles most of the ebook loans through libraries.
So Penguin's been one of the problematic publishers, right? Do we have any idea if Penguin likes this concept?
I don't know. I don't know if they do or not.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see if this ends up being sort of the creative solution where everybody feels that they win.
Yeah, it'll definitely be something to watch.
So tell us about DIY org.
Again, like I said earlier, I'm really interested in what education technology companies do under the hood, and so I was pleased to see DIY.org, which we talked about a few weeks ago when they launched. It's a online community for maker kids to sort of share photos of share photos online with what they've built. And I just wanted to sort of recognize that DIY had open sourced a lot of its code. Some pretty interesting technologies that web tools, Node.js, for example, some HTML5, JavaScript things that other companies will be able to use. But I think that their whole rationale of why you would open source your code, why you would share how things work, and make it possible for people to tinker with the code fits very nicely into the maker philosophy, which is you do want to be able to take things apart. You want to be able to have the right to discover how things work in the world. And I like it that they're sort of putting their money where their mouth is and having their own website code, their own mobile app work the same way.
So again, this conversation of platform and adoption versus system. This feels very much like a platform, kind of a place for people to come and be creative and do their own thing. Do we have any sense of adoption? Are kids actually going on to this site, and is it succeeding?
They've had some very nice publicity and a really great New York Times write-up. They're only a couple months old, so I'm not sure what the momentum has been. So I don't know the answer to that, but they've had some great press lately.
Any connection to O'Reilly or Maker Fairs, or just by virtue of similar ideas?
Similar ideas.
I can imagine them having a lot of fun working together.
Yeah.
So Bing starts adding Encyclopedia Britannica information to their search results pages.
Yeah, this is Microsoft's search engine Bing. They've partnered with Encyclopedia Britannica, which I thought was interesting considering it was just a few months ago when the encyclopedia ended its print run, and thinking about the not just the future of Bing, which is sort of in this I think battle with Google to sort of be our relevant search engine, but thinking too about the relevancy of Encyclopedia Britannica, that they've chosen to partner with Microsoft in order to sort of have their encyclopedia entries sort of surface automatically when you search for something. Again, sort of comparing the Google search with Bing. This was certainly a smart move on the part of Bing to be able to have an easily accessible sort of encyclopedia digest like summary of some of the search terms.
It's sort of intriguingly two relatively proprietary organizations.
Yes. Yeah, it's,
Yeah.
I didn't, I mean, not to be too mean, but yeah, thinking about sort of Microsoft plus the Encyclopedia Britannica, I didn't want to make too much of that, but there you go.
Very interesting. Okay. Again, a disclosure disclaimer. So I'm doing consulting work for Gina Bianchini, like I did for Ning, but on her new project Mighty Bell, which I like quite a bit. But I'm going to let you talk about it because I feel like it's not appropriate for me to.
Well, actually, let's talk about it next week because I actually want to do a longer deep dive into what she's working. I think it's worth a whole article and not just a blurb. So we'll save that conversation for next week. How about that?
You may have to get another
And
co-host. I got to be careful. I love the idea. So let's talk in sort of general ideas and not for too long, but and no, we have next week. But the whole idea of curation and conversation
yes, I
is
think
at
the
the heart of
conversation.
Mighty Bell and at the heart of Learnist.
Yeah, and I think we're about to see Adam Bellow from Edutecher is going to be launching a what sounds like perhaps a similar idea as well. And I think sort of seeing now really people, teachers in particular, educators thinking about how can we take the popularity of curation and use that in such a way that we can have smart conversations with our learning communities about what we're finding online. So I think that it's clearly an idea that lots of folks are working on.
Awesome. Okay. The article from Inside Higher Ed,
Hmm.
looking at the survey data from Coursera,
Right. Well, this
had
was from it was actually from the Stanford, one of the Stanford classes last fall, so pre
oh, got it.
Coursera. Yeah.
So for me, the really interesting piece here was that 74% of those who responded came from outside the U.S.
Yes. I think that this is the piece that some of these discussions that we're having, particularly the folks that you're seeing make these pronouncements about MOOCs. I'm using that word, but you know that now there's a little asterisk by it. The Stanford model MOOCs, how these are sort of revolutionizing higher education, how the MOOC is going to change the way in which we think about sort of the delivery of this material, university level material. I think that this piece about the demographics of who is actually enrolled in these classes is we are not discussing, and I think that that's, to me, this is really where the potential lies. It's not so much folks who would normally have gone to the University of Oregon, for example, are now taking classes from Stanford. I think we're talking about people in India who normally would have not had any access to higher education at all, whether India universities in India or universities anywhere, are now taking classes at Stanford. To me, that is what is incredibly important about the MOOC.
Interesting. You have a short note here on the outlook for employment being fairly grim. I couldn't tell if the 16% who've graduated from since 2009 and have not been able to find a full-time job, that's high school graduates, right?
Correct.
Okay. So those who've graduated high school, do we have any comparable figures for college graduates?
I I don't know what the figures are for college graduates. I'm
But
guessing
certainly
it's grim.
for, well, I've wondered this. Certainly for high school graduates, this is grim.
Yes.
16%. And my guess is that it's not as low for college graduates, but still probably pretty grim.
Yeah, I think that it is incredibly difficult whether you are 18 with a high school diploma or 22, 23 with a college diploma. I think that finding full-time work right now, for youth, I guess I can call them youth, 25 or younger, you're a kid. Kids, it's hard for kids to find work, no matter whether they've, you know, completed high school, completed college. It's tough. And I think that one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting about this survey data was that kids themselves recognize that, and there seem to be massive cracks in the American dream among this generation who say that they know that their lives will not be as successful financially as their parents. And to me, that really runs counter to a lot of the sort of one of the very sort of fundamental myths I think in this country, that our generations are always improving upon each other. That there's always more opportunity and better opportunity, and I thought it's profoundly sad to think that young folks today feel as though there are not opportunities.
So rising college costs,
Mm-hmm.
rising student loans,
Yep.
and and certainly sort of discouraging job reports, at least May and the revisions from earlier this year in the United States, but would sort of lead us to believe that we're headed toward, some kind of a rethink or at least some concern. I've been curious that there's been a lot going on in Canada that we're not hearing a lot about here.
Yes, with the students in Quebec who I think have been on strike for months now. It is interesting to, and I think that there are, student uprisings all over the world that we tend not to pay attention to. But I do think it's interesting that the students in Montreal have not, considering the proximity of Montreal, that we don't hear much at all about what's happening there.
I don't want us to be the conspiracy theorist guy, but is it part of, is it possible that part of the reason we don't hear that is that that's not a very rewarding story for media companies to tell, that kind of depend on advertisers and the like, that this is maybe a sort of a larger conflict that's not one that people really want to be promoting right now?
Yeah, I think that that's interesting. I mean, I think that it's thinking about some of the origins around the Arab Spring, which were also, I think, intimately tied up with this notion of young folks feeling like there was no economic opportunity for them. And young folks, many of whom had college degrees too, sort of the educated young folks who felt as though that the system was rotten, that there were no opportunities, and they took to the streets in a powerful way to sort of make things happen, to sort of seize their future. I think it's a compelling story to tell, I think, for our media when we can sort of shroud it in terms of a drive towards democracy. I think you have to sort of dig a lot deeper when students in Montreal are sort of wanting to seize their future in the same way. It's harder to sort of say that this is about a drive towards democracy, even though I think part of the reason that the students are protesting there as well is there were some free speech, freedom of assembly laws that were sort of cracking down on the rights for people to be in the streets. But I think that I do think that it's easier to tell a story about the rising tide of democracy among Arab youth than it is to say to have to look at why students are up in arms in Montreal.
You'd also have to be a little bit worried that you don't want to precipitate a conflagration, right? But
Right.
if there is dissatisfaction, I think that law in Canada was passed that in response to the student protests, right?
I think so. Yeah.
So I guess the concern would be if there's dissatisfaction and it begins to manifest itself in these kinds of demonstrations, are we prepared for that? And I'm not suggesting that we're at that spot, but it does feel as though that's probably an easy place to see that dissatisfaction getting expressed vocally.
Although, I mean, I think this is one of the things I actually realized I didn't include in my weekly roundup, but, we saw a great deal of dissatisfaction, people taking to the streets in this country around the Occupy movements, Occupy Wall Street, and certainly the things that happened in Wisconsin after Governor Scott Walker passed some of his, or, pushing through his anti-union measures. And it's, I often wonder sort of what is it about Americans in particular that we seem very reluctant to take to the streets. That what's happened to the Occupy movement? It seemed really powerful at one point, and now it doesn't seem to be such a strong driving force for conversation, let alone change. And certainly the failed recall election of Governor Walker last week, have to ask the same questions. Where is the outrage, and what in this country gets sort of, how quickly does it get dissipated and funneled into other interests?
Interesting. There's probably a story there as well in terms of politics and money.
Right.
Meaning, if the view of success is accumulating that financial power to affect change. That's sort of a story we tell ourselves that's very different than the story of dissatisfaction.
Yes. Yeah.
Speaking of money, Philadelphia's has just had devastating budget cuts for education. Science Leadership Academy is trying to crowdfund the purchase of their laptops for their one-to-one program.
Yeah, I consider Chris Lehman a dear friend, and I chipped in with my pledge here, but I got to say that to me it was a pretty strong indication of how messed up things are, and I don't just mean messed up in terms of the Philadelphia budgets, which are sort of the crisis is sort of unbelievably bad in the city of Philadelphia. But it makes me very sad to think about a school like SLA, which many folks point to as a model for project-based learning, and it's a one-to-one laptop school. Certainly, Apple hasn't shown sort of loves to feature SLA in its commercials. The fact that we're sort of having to the SLA would have to turn to a crowdfunding platform to me just seemed incredibly sad for where our priorities are. And I hope that I mean really I would love to see Apple do the right thing here and pay for SLA's laptops. I mean I think Apple could take its $1 billion and buy every kid a laptop, but I'll start with my wishes small, and that would be that Apple would pitch in for some new MacBooks for for Chris's school.
We're going to leave that as our last comment.
Okay.
Thanks for a great week, Audrey.
Thanks, Steve. Bye.
Bye.